You're stepping into June 1815. The fields of Waterloo stretching before you like a green canvas ready to be painted with blood and history. The tension is palpable, the smell of impending destruction filling the air. Napoleon Bonaparte, with his grand ambitions and legendary bravado, faces off against an alliance of British, Dutch, Belgian, and Prussian forces led by the unflappable Duke of Wellington and the resolute Blücher. This wasn't just any battle. This was the final stand, the last act of a man who thought himself invincible. But the strategies at play here, the ones you might not even notice, are what make this clash so fascinating. Historians love to look at the obvious: the charge of the Imperial Guard, the infantry squares, the cavalry clashes. But what about the hidden strategies? The overlooked moments? The undercurrent of preparation, deception, and miscalculation? You probably think of Waterloo as a single decisive battle, but it was more like a carefully woven tapestry of little-known decisions. Decisions that made or broke the battle. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let's set the scene. It's the day before the battle, and Napoleon is pacing like a tiger in a cage. His nerves are tight, his plans nearly set. You're probably picturing him confidently making his final preparations, but here's the twist. Napoleon's grand strategy is actually based on a critical miscalculation, a mistake he'll never fully realize until it's too late. Napoleon's big mistake isn't just the attack itself. It's the way he dismisses the small things, the weather, the terrain, and the timing, things that in hindsight seem obvious but weren't so clear to him. Historians still argue whether his overconfidence led him astray, or if it was simply bad luck that shifted the tide. As Napoleon's forces gather and prepare to march toward the battlefield, the British and their allies are nervously waiting. But the one thing that you can't help but notice is the sense of hesitation that hangs in the air. Is it because Wellington, a master of military strategy, is overthinking the weather? Is he second-guessing the terrain? Historians still argue whether this delay in action was a mark of caution or the sign of a commander overwhelmed by the impending clash. The first real strategic misstep happens before the battle even begins. Napoleon's initial plan to attack the Allied forces before they can unite. This was a bold move, aiming to divide the British and the Prussians before they could combine their forces. But the one thing Napoleon couldn't predict was the weather. The heavy rain turns the battlefield into a quagmire, delaying his attack. This, quite literally, is where the battle begins to slip out of his grasp. As the rain falls, a frustrating, seemingly trivial delay shifts the entire momentum of the battle. Napoleon had planned to launch his assault early in the day, but now, the ground is soaked, making it impossible for his artillery to fire effectively. Imagine standing there, mud splashing around your boots, with your grand plans slipping away as you watch the rain pour down like nature itself, mocking your ambition. For Napoleon, this is more than a weather inconvenience. It's a massive blow to his strategy. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's decision to wait until later in the day to attack was a tactical blunder or a necessary pause. Was he really waiting for the ground to dry? Or did he simply overestimate his ability to control the battlefield's logistics? Either way, the delay allows the British and Prussians to solidify their positions. The very thing Napoleon hoped to prevent, an Allied coalition coming together, is exactly what he inadvertently facilitates. Now, let's zoom in on Wellington, the man whose name is synonymous with calm and calculated strategy. You might imagine him sipping tea, not really feeling the pressure, but behind that stoic face is a commander fully aware that this battle could make or break his entire career. As the hours pass, Wellington ponders whether he's overestimating the need for careful planning. There's no guarantee that his troops will hold if Napoleon charges early. He's got the high ground, but that doesn't guarantee victory, and he knows it. His hesitation isn't just a reflection of his military acumen. It's also a psychological game. Historians love to debate whether this careful pacing was a stroke of genius or a sign of doubt creeping in. The clock ticks, and Napoleon finally gives the order to advance. But there's a secret in this delay. While Napoleon is busy trying to perfect his plan, Wellington is doing something subtle. He's using his time wisely, not just waiting, but strengthening his position. You see, his forces aren't simply waiting for Napoleon to make his move. They're preparing in a way that's often overlooked in the typical battle analysis. You might think that Wellington's secret weapon is his iconic infantry squares, which held off cavalry charges. But here's the thing. Those squares are only the visible part of his brilliance. The true magic lies in the psychological warfare he's playing. He knows the French are overconfident, and in that slight pause, Wellington begins to chip away at their morale. The British forces' calmness, their organization, and their apparent lack of panic start to work as a psychological weapon in itself. Napoleon's men, on the other hand, are growing restless. This is the kind of strategic advantage you don't often read about in textbooks. The timing of Wellington's tactics is crucial. He knows that the longer he holds his ground, the more likely it is that the Prussians will arrive. And while Napoleon is distracted by his delayed attack, Wellington uses that extra time to rally his troops, reinforcing their confidence. Historians argue that Wellington's ability to remain poised during these moments of uncertainty is what set him apart from many other commanders. The longer the battle drags on, the less likely it is that Napoleon can win. But here's the kicker. Napoleon's overconfidence, his reliance on the invincible Imperial Guard, blinds him to the real threat emerging from the Prussian forces. As much as Napoleon focuses on dividing the British and Prussian alliances, he fails to account for the stubborn resilience of his opponents. He underestimated Blucher. This is something historians still debate. Was it hubris, or did Napoleon genuinely believe that he could crush the Allies before the Prussians could reinforce them? Napoleon's second major error was his assumption that his Imperial Guard would break the Allies' lines. You can almost picture him watching from a distance, believing that the Guard's advance would lead to a decisive victory. But history reveals a sobering truth. The Imperial Guard, considered Napoleon's ultimate weapon, is deployed too late in the battle. By the time they march onto the field, the momentum has already shifted. Was this a strategic blunder, or did Napoleon simply misread the situation? Historians are divided on this, but one thing is clear. Sending the Guard too late was a fatal mistake. Now, the battle is underway, and the thunderous rumble of cannons fills the air. The Imperial Guard is marching forward, but the battle is already slipping through Napoleon's fingers. This is the part of Waterloo where things go from bad to worse for the French. Napoleon, the man who had crushed countless armies across Europe, now faces an insurmountable tide. And what's the worst part? His own forces are starting to sense it too. Historians often look at the Imperial Guard as a symbol of Napoleon's grandeur, his ultimate reserve. But there's a massive flaw in this thinking. The Guard deployment wasn't the triumph Napoleon envisioned. It was the turning point of his downfall. The Guard was designed to be Napoleon's finishing blow, the force that would secure victory after all the preliminary skirmishes. But as they advanced, it became painfully clear the battle was no longer about heroic charges or tactical brilliance. The ground had already been lost. The Prussians, led by Blucher, were arriving on the scene, reinforcing Wellington's troops and pushing Napoleon's army closer to collapse. As the Imperial Guard approaches the Allied lines, Napoleon probably sees it as the final opportunity to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But what he doesn't see, or refuses to acknowledge, is that the momentum has shifted. The British and the Prussians have held firm long enough, and now, with the Imperial Guard charging, it feels like a death knell. Historians still debate whether this final attempt to break the enemy lines was Napoleon's last great gamble or a desperate, misguided act of defiance. Meanwhile, Wellington, who had been anxiously watching the French forces advance, is not exactly calm, but he's well prepared for this moment. His infantry squares, which have been tested time and time again against cavalry charges, are now facing the might of Napoleon's prize guard. But the squares hold firm, and here's where Wellington's genius truly shines. While the French elite units were once invincible in the minds of many, they meet a much tougher opponent than they anticipated. Wellington's troops had been drilled, trained, and reinforced for precisely this moment. It wasn't just about physical endurance, it was about the ability to endure mentally. The British soldiers' morale is resilient, and that's what keeps them standing as the Imperial Guard presses forward. But there's a catch. It's not just Wellington's troops holding strong. The Prussians are arriving in full force, their disciplined ranks charging onto the battlefield. It's almost cinematic. Blücher, riding across the battlefield, rallying his troops as they close in on the exhausted French forces. It's the moment Napoleon feared most, and the moment that no one really saw coming. The Prussian cavalry, arriving at just the right moment, delivering a devastating blow to the French forces. Historians often miss the importance of Blücher's arrival. It's not just the cavalry itself, it's the timing. Blücher's forces aren't just reinforcements. They're a symbol of hope for the Allied army. When Napoleon's Imperial Guard finally begins to break, the Prussians pour in from the rear, trapping the French army between Wellington's forces and their own fears of annihilation. It's like the perfect storm. Napoleon has been fighting with one hand tied behind his back, and now, with his reserve forces depleted, his army begins to disintegrate. You probably picture this moment as a grand, heroic charge, with Blücher leading his forces into the heart of Napoleon's army. But the reality is a bit more chaotic. It's more like an angry swarm of bees. The Prussians hit the French from behind, forcing them to retreat and shattering their already fragile morale. The French retreat is as sudden as it is inevitable. The battle that was supposed to be Napoleon's final victory turns into an overwhelming defeat, and the French army begins to collapse under the pressure. And what of Napoleon? As his forces retreat, he must have known that the game was up. He's been outmaneuvered, outlasted, and outnumbered. Historians debate whether Napoleon's decision to retreat was a sign of cowardice or a desperate attempt to regroup. But one thing is clear. By the time the Imperial Guard breaks and the Prussians arrive in full force, the battle is lost. The man who once dominated Europe is now facing the bitter reality of his fall. The final stages of the battle are a blur of confusion, panic, and shattered dreams. The French army crumbles under the combined pressure of the British, the Prussians, and the relentless onslaught of reality. Waterloo is over, but the consequences of Napoleon's overconfidence and strategic blunders will echo throughout history. With the French army retreating in disarray, you might think the battle is over, but this is where the real story of Waterloo starts to get a little more complicated. Sure, the French are losing, but Napoleon himself isn't necessarily running for the hills just yet. No, the true unraveling begins in the aftermath. The moment when Napoleon realizes that the tactical game he once so expertly played has slipped through his fingers. As Napoleon's forces flee, the Allied army, bolstered by the timely arrival of the Prussians, tightens its grip. For Wellington, the task of mopping up the remnants of the French forces becomes a brutal affair of chasing down stragglers and securing the battlefield. But even as Wellington consolidates his victory, there's a deeper question lingering in the air. Could Napoleon have salvaged anything from this disastrous outcome? Historians have long speculated about this. Could a strategic withdrawal have saved his empire? Or was the defeat too overwhelming to recover from? Wellington's role in this moment is often downplayed. He's celebrated for his calm leadership throughout the day, but now, with victory in hand, he must confront the reality of what comes next. How do you manage a battlefield of this scale? How do you deal with the broken, defeated French troops scattered across the plains? And how do you stop your own soldiers from overreaching in their pursuit of glory? The battlefield is littered with casualties on both sides, some dead, others wounded, and many more captured. As much as this moment is a victory for the Allied forces, it's also a grim reminder of the heavy toll war takes. Wellington's forces may have won, but Waterloo is hardly a scene of unbridled celebration. Even in victory, there's a weight of responsibility. Historians have often overlooked the burden that fell on Wellington in the days after the battle. The need to secure, restore, and rebuild. It's easy to imagine that, with Napoleon's downfall, Wellington must have breathed a sigh of relief. But it wasn't over yet. The war may have ended on the battlefield, but the political and military consequences of the battle would ripple for years to come. Now, let's talk about Napoleon's retreat. The phrase retreating in disgrace doesn't quite do justice to the complexity of what happened in the aftermath of Waterloo. Napoleon, the master tactician who had once conquered much of Europe, finds himself on the run, his career in ruins. Historians argue whether his decision to retreat was strategic or merely the product of desperation. It's important to remember that this wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the collapse of an empire, a moment when the man who had shaped Europe for over a decade was reduced to a mere fugitive. Napoleon's retreat, though, is not one of immediate surrender. Instead, it's a dramatic, almost tragic final act, a slow march away from the battlefield, his mind racing with thoughts of what went wrong. There's a poignant moment here. Napoleon is defeated, yes, but he's not entirely broken. In his mind, he's still the Emperor of France, and his escape is not so much a retreat as a calculated move to survive. The question that lingers is, could he have made a comeback? Could he have regrouped, reassembled his forces, and launched another campaign? Historians are divided on this issue. Some argue that Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo was absolute, while others suggest that, had he lived to fight another day, his strategic genius could have found a way to regain his empire. Meanwhile, the Allied forces begin to clean up the mess left behind by the battle. But the task of dealing with Napoleon's shattered forces isn't just about managing prisoners or casualties. It's about political strategy. Napoleon's reign may have ended, but the questions surrounding his legacy continue to loom large. The rest of Europe is watching, wondering whether the fall of Napoleon will signal a new era or simply the start of another struggle for dominance. As the battle fades into history, Waterloo becomes more than just a military engagement. It becomes a symbol of change, a turning point in European history. Napoleon's downfall is a dramatic and well-documented event, but historians still debate whether it was inevitable. Could a different approach to the battle have changed the outcome? Would the French forces have rallied if Napoleon had been able to execute his strategy flawlessly? It's impossible to say, but one thing is certain. Waterloo will remain a captivating subject of debate and analysis for centuries to come. The final moments of the battle, the withdrawal of Napoleon, and the aftermath are crucial in understanding the lasting impact of Waterloo. It wasn't just the victory of the Allies that changed the course of history. It was the shattering of Napoleon's myth and the beginning of a new order in Europe. As Wellington secures his position and Napoleon flees, the echoes of this day reverberate across the continent. For some, it's a triumph, but for others, it's the end of an era. And for Napoleon, the question that lingers is not just how his army was defeated, but whether his empire could have been saved, if only he had made a few different decisions. By now, Napoleon's fate is sealed, but the reverberations of Waterloo continue to unfold. As the dust settles on the battlefield, both Napoleon and Europe are left to grapple with the consequences of this massive clash. For the French, the defeat is a moment of undeniable tragedy, but for the rest of Europe, it marks a profound turning point in the balance of power. The question that still lingers in the minds of historians is not just about the strategies employed in battle, but about the profound political consequences that would follow. Napoleon's retreat was more than just a strategic move. It was the unraveling of a myth. The once unstoppable general, the man who had redefined the map of Europe, now found himself a prisoner of his own failure. The battle itself might have been lost, but it was the political aftermath that would leave Europe in a delicate and tense state for years to come. Napoleon was forced to abdicate once again and exiled to the island of St. Helena, far away from the power he once held so effortlessly. The question is, could the Allies have been more lenient? Historians argue over the fate of Napoleon after Waterloo. Some argue that he should have been allowed to live out his days in France, while others claim that the French emperor's fall had to be complete in order to avoid any future threats to the European order. Wellington, now a hero in Britain, was far from a man content with a mere victory. There was work to be done, and that included securing not only the peace, but the future stability of Europe. The Congress of Vienna was already underway, and as much as Waterloo had been a military victory, It was ultimately a political triumph. Historians love to speculate about whether the Congress would have unfolded the same way without the finality that Waterloo provided. The defeat of Napoleon allowed the Allies to shape the future of Europe, drawing borders, deciding fates, and creating new alliances. But there was a cost to this victory, one that wouldn't fully be understood until years later. As Wellington took his victory lap, he would become a key player in reshaping Europe, but it wasn't just about the maps or treaties. The real legacy of Waterloo lies in how it transformed the political fabric of Europe. The post-Napoleonic world was a different place, an era where the memory of the battle loomed large, reminding everyone that the future was never secure, and that one mistake, one misstep, could cost everything. Historians still debate whether the Congress of Vienna truly established peace, or if it merely set the stage for new conflicts in the years to come. Could the European powers have avoided future wars with a more democratic approach to diplomacy? Or was war always going to be the answer? These questions linger long after the final cannon fire of Waterloo. The end of the Napoleonic Wars didn't mean the end of Napoleon's influence. His legacy would shape military strategy, political thinking, and the course of European history for generations. Historians still argue about whether his strategies were truly revolutionary or whether he was simply a man of his time, adapting to the needs of the moment. In either case, Napoleon left an indelible mark on history, and Waterloo remains the defining moment of his downfall. But what about the men who fought on the ground? The soldiers who did the real work while Napoleon and Wellington worked their strategies. The rank and file of Waterloo are often forgotten in the grand sweep of history. They're seen as pawns in a greater game, but their sacrifices and experiences were vital to the outcome of the battle. These soldiers, many of whom had been part of the ongoing wars for years, were exhausted. Their loyalty to their leaders was tested in ways that would have been unimaginable before the conflict. Historians argue that the battle's true human cost is often underreported. These soldiers were more than just tools of war. They were people caught in a system they couldn't control, trying to survive in the most brutal of circumstances. As the final French forces retreat, it's clear that Napoleon's empire is no more. But even in defeat, he remains an enigma. His ambition and genius led to his rise, but they also led to his fall. The legacy of Waterloo is more than just a battlefield. It's a reminder of the fragility of power and the unpredictable nature of history. Historians still wonder, if Napoleon had been less ambitious, would he have stayed in power longer? Could he have avoided Waterloo by making different strategic choices, or was his downfall inevitable? Waterloo answered these questions in the most definitive way possible, through a devastating loss that reshaped Europe and forever altered the course of history. But the aftermath of Waterloo is far from simple. While Napoleon's reign has ended, the repercussions of his wars will echo for decades. The Congress of Vienna will seek to restore the European balance, but not without significant tension. The world order may have changed, but peace is fragile. With Napoleon gone, the true work of shaping Europe's future begins, an effort that will be marked by diplomacy, but also by the understanding that Waterloo was not just a battle for land. It was a battle for ideas, for the future of Europe itself. With Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, Europe is left in a delicate state of transition. The echoes of the battle still linger, but now it's time for the dust to settle, for the wounded to heal, and for new powers to rise. Yet the impact of this monumental clash reaches far beyond the battlefield. While the battlefield may have been won by the Allies, the real challenge lay in the aftermath: how to rebuild a continent that had been ravaged by decades of war. Wellington, now a hero to many, finds himself at the center of this rebuilding process. His victory at Waterloo secured his place in history, but the true test lay ahead. How would the Allies handle the delicate task of reshaping Europe? The political landscape was shifting, and Napoleon's fall, though momentous, left behind a vacuum that needed to be filled. The Congress of Vienna had already begun, aiming to redraw the map of Europe, but the stakes were higher than anyone could have predicted. The decisions made at Vienna would shape European diplomacy for years to come, but they would also sow the seeds for future conflicts. Historians argue whether the Congress of Vienna truly achieved its goals. Some say it created a balance of power that helped avoid major wars in Europe for nearly a century. Others claim that it merely delayed inevitable conflict, leaving unresolved tensions that would eventually lead to the outbreak of World War I. The diplomats who gathered in Vienna had no idea that the future would hold such a devastating war, but their decisions, influenced by the outcome of Waterloo, set the stage for it. Meanwhile, Napoleon's fate is sealed. He is exiled to the island of St. Helena, where he will live out the rest of his days, a once mighty emperor now reduced to a prisoner of war. The irony is striking. The man who once controlled much of Europe now spends his time in isolation, far from the power he once wielded so effortlessly. Historians have long debated whether Napoleon's exile was a fitting punishment or a cruel fate for a man who had once been at the height of his power. Was he truly a victim of his own ambition, or was his downfall simply the result of too many miscalculations? Even in exile, Napoleon's influence remains potent. His name is still whispered throughout Europe, and his legacy continues to shape military strategy, political thought, and even popular culture. Despite his defeat, Napoleon remains one of history's most compelling figures. His ambition, his genius, and his ultimate fall serve as a cautionary tale for those who would seek to conquer the world. And while his empire may have crumbled, his impact on history is undeniable. But Waterloo is more than just the end of Napoleon. It is the end of an era in European history. The world that Napoleon sought to create, a world dominated by one man and his empire, fades into the past. In its place is a new Europe, one shaped by alliances, treaties, and a new balance of power. The long wars that had defined the previous decades are finally over, but the world that emerges from the ashes of battle is one that remains fraught with tension. The victory at Waterloo does not bring instant peace. Instead, it sets the stage for a new chapter in European history, one that will be defined by complex diplomacy, shifting alliances, and the lingering specter of war. The question of Napoleon's legacy is one that historians continue to grapple with. Was he a genius who overreached? A man of his time who sought to create a new world order? Or was he simply a tyrant who sought to impose his will on Europe? While opinions on Napoleon are varied, one thing is clear: his influence cannot be denied. His rise and fall are a testament to the power of ambition, the fragility of empire, and the unpredictability of history. Waterloo, for all its drama and spectacle, is not just a military clash. It is a moment that encapsulates the essence of war, its unpredictability, its costs, and its lasting impact. The outcome of the battle may have been decided by strategy, timing, and sheer willpower, but the consequences of Waterloo stretch far beyond the battlefield. As Europe picks up the pieces after Napoleon's fall, the story of Waterloo is one of both triumph and tragedy, a reminder that the course of history is never truly set in stone, and that even the greatest of empires can crumble in an instant. As Europe adjusts to life after Waterloo, the lingering questions about the battle and its aftermath are just beginning to take shape. Napoleon's legacy, for all its grandeur, is now bound to the defeat at Waterloo. But this doesn't mean the story of Waterloo ends with his exile. The true ripple effects of this momentous battle aren't felt immediately. Instead, they begin to reverberate through the halls of European diplomacy, setting the stage for decades of political intrigue, shifting alliances, and eventually, more conflict. The immediate aftermath of Waterloo saw the establishment of the so-called Concert of Europe. This was a period where the major powers of Europe, Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, worked together to ensure that no single nation would rise to dominate Europe again. It was a noble effort, a push toward a new kind of diplomacy where cooperation, rather than outright conflict, was the goal. But as we all know, history has a funny way of throwing curveballs, and this carefully crafted balance of power was far from perfect. Wellington, now hailed as a military hero and political player, found himself at the center of this new order. But his influence was not unlimited. He, along with the other leaders, would quickly learn that maintaining peace wasn't as simple as drawing borders and signing treaties. The new alliances were fragile, and old tensions, which had been simmering beneath the surface for years, didn't vanish with Napoleon's exile. The power vacuum left by his downfall was quickly filled with new rivalries, some old, some newly created by the shifting tides of political power. Historians still debate how much of a lasting peace was actually achieved by the Congress of Vienna. Some argue that it was the cornerstone of European stability for nearly a century, keeping large-scale war at bay for generations. Others claim that it merely delayed the inevitable, setting the stage for the rise of nationalism and the pressures that would eventually lead to World War I. One thing is certain: the peace forged in the wake of Waterloo was fragile. It was only a matter of time before the European powers were drawn into new conflicts. Napoleon's defeat and the subsequent reshaping of Europe also had a profound impact on the social and political fabric of the continent. His fall marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but the ideas he had championed, such as the spread of revolutionary ideals, the creation of new legal systems, and the notion of a nation-state, did not disappear. Instead, they found new outlets. Nationalism, which had been ignited by Napoleon's campaigns, continued to spread across Europe, and the notion of self-determination became a powerful force that would shape future revolutions and conflicts. The revolutionary zeal that Napoleon's regime had inspired didn't die with him. In fact, many of the social reforms he instituted, such as the Napoleonic Code, continued to influence European legal systems for years to come. These reforms were not just a legacy of Napoleon's rule. They were a direct challenge to the old feudal structures that had long dominated Europe. Even in defeat, Napoleon's legacy continued to challenge the established order and push for a more modern, centralized, and legally uniform Europe. But what about the man himself? Napoleon, the self-proclaimed Emperor of France, now found himself exiled on the island of St. Helena, far removed from the glory and grandeur he had once known. His time in exile is often portrayed as a tragic end to his once mighty career, but historians still debate the nature of his last years. Some argue that his final years were marked by resignation and despair, while others claim that Napoleon remained as ambitious and politically active as ever, despite being far from the halls of power. There are accounts from those who interacted with Napoleon during his exile that suggest he remained sharp, intelligent, and deeply reflective about his career. He spent his days in relative comfort on St. Helena, engaging in conversation, writing, and reflecting on his past. His memoirs, written during this time, have become some of the most important sources for understanding his thoughts and motivations. They reveal a man who was still deeply committed to his vision of European unity, though now that vision was entirely out of reach. Historians continue to argue about how to interpret Napoleon's legacy. Was he a revolutionary leader who pushed Europe forward into a new era? Or was he simply an ambitious conqueror who sought to dominate the continent at any cost? The answer is probably somewhere in between. Napoleon's influence on Europe was undeniably profound, and his defeat at Waterloo didn't erase the impact he had on the course of history. Instead, it added a new chapter to his story, one marked by reflection, exile, and ultimately enduring fascination. As the years passed and the dust of Waterloo settled, the lessons of the battle became clearer. The old world order, shaped by the Napoleonic Wars, was gone. In its place was a new European system, one built on delicate alliances, diplomacy, and the desire to avoid another war of the scale of the Napoleonic conflicts. But, as we know all too well, this balance would be tested again and again as the passions and rivalries of Europe remain just beneath the surface. As the decades stretch on, the legacy of Waterloo fades from immediate memory, but its influence never fully disappears. The battle wasn't just a moment in time. It was the culmination of ideas, ambitions, and forces that would continue to shape the world long after the cannons fell silent. The impact of Waterloo and the ensuing political realignments touched every aspect of life in Europe: military, political, and social. Wellington's role in shaping the post-Waterloo order is often credited with stabilizing Europe, But in truth, his efforts were as much about managing tensions as they were about promoting peace. The peace that followed was not the end of conflict. It was the beginning of a new, more complex world. The idea of European cooperation, while promoted at the Congress of Vienna, was fragile. European powers, though now united in their shared desire to avoid the spread of revolutionary ideas, were also driven by old rivalries and new tensions. Historians love to point out the irony here. While Europe celebrated its victory over Napoleon, the reality was that Waterloo didn't eliminate the causes of war. Instead, it shifted them. The balance of power that had been carefully crafted at Vienna was soon tested by nationalist movements, colonial ambitions, and rising industrial power. The question was never whether Europe would face conflict again, but when. For every diplomat who signed a treaty, there were others plotting their next move. The true legacy of Waterloo wasn't the absence of war. It was the realization that history is cyclical. What Waterloo demonstrated was that power is always in flux, that no victory is ever truly final. On the ground, however, life in the post-Waterloo era began to change in profound ways. The Industrial Revolution, which had been quietly gaining momentum, would now reshape Europe's economy. The war years had drained resources, and the continent was weary. Yet, in the ashes of war, there was a renewed sense of purpose. The Industrial Revolution would bring about technological advancements that would alter the way wars were fought, but it would also impact the lives of ordinary people. Factories would begin to replace fields, and urbanization would bring about shifts in social structures. Napoleon, for all his faults, had been a revolutionary figure. His ambitions had changed the shape of Europe, from the legal systems he left behind with the Napoleonic Code to the way modern armies were structured. But in defeat, he also left a new path forward. His fall marked the end of one era, but his ideas, whether you agreed with them or not, would continue to influence future generations. Historians still debate how revolutionary Napoleon truly was. Was he a harbinger of change, a man whose ambitions and reforms could have led to a different Europe? Or was he simply a product of his time, a brilliant general who met his match in Waterloo? The fall of Napoleon marked the end of the era of empires and absolutism. In its place, the idea of nation-states began to take hold across Europe. This idea would come to dominate European politics in the 19th century. Napoleon's downfall didn't eliminate the forces of nationalism. Rather, it fueled them. His downfall created a power vacuum, and in that vacuum, a new political force began to emerge. Nationalism would soon sweep through Europe, creating the conditions for new revolutions and new states, and the long process of political fragmentation that would characterize much of the 19th century had begun. But even as Europe moved toward a new era of statehood and industrialization, the ghost of Waterloo remained. Napoleon's story became one of myth, a tale of ambition and downfall that captured the imagination of generations. His dramatic rise and fall would be recounted in history books, in poetry, and in art for centuries to come. The story of Waterloo, for all its military precision and brutality, was also a story of human nature, of ambition, overreach, and the inevitable consequences of both. The tragedy of Napoleon's life lies in his inability to see the limits of his own power, and in his belief that he could change the very fabric of Europe through sheer force of will. Even as new empires rose and new political movements gained traction, Napoleon remained a figure of fascination. His military genius, his ambition, and his complex personality made him a figure who could never be truly erased from the annals of history. The debates over his legacy would continue long after Waterloo, with some seeing him as a visionary and others as a tyrant. Either way, his influence was undeniable. Waterloo had more than just military and political consequences. It was the end of a Napoleonic dream, but the beginning of a new European order. It was the beginning of the 19th century's most defining challenges: the rise of nationalism, the quest for power, and the reshaping of Europe's social and political landscape. The end of Waterloo was the beginning of something far larger, and its true legacy wouldn't be fully realized until the Europe that emerged in its wake was tested by the forces it had unleashed. As the 19th century unfolds, the shadow of Waterloo continues to hang over Europe, but it's clear that the landscape is changing. For the powers that emerged victorious, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, the challenge was not just one of military victory, but of political consolidation. The defeat of Napoleon and the end of the Napoleonic Wars had left Europe in a fractured state, with shifting allegiances, territorial disputes, and unresolved questions about the future. Wellington, though celebrated as a hero, was not immune to the challenges that lay ahead. While he played a critical role in the Congress of Vienna, the diplomatic successes he achieved were fragile at best. The balance of power he and his fellow diplomats sought to create was not designed to last forever. It was merely a temporary solution to a far deeper problem: Europe's growing nationalism and the rise of new political ideologies. Waterloo may have marked the end of one era, but it was also the catalyst for a new set of struggles. The post-Waterloo era saw the rise of nationalist movements across Europe, movements that were fueled by the very ideals Napoleon had inadvertently spread. The notion of a nation-state, the idea of people united by a common identity and culture, began to take hold. This was the true legacy of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had inadvertently inspired people to think of themselves not as subjects of monarchs, but as citizens of nations. These new nationalist movements, while born out of the chaos of war, would become some of the most powerful forces in European politics for the rest of the century. Historians often point to this period as the beginning of the end for the old order in Europe. The traditional empires and monarchies that had once dominated the continent were increasingly challenged by a rising tide of nationalist sentiment. The idea of national sovereignty, once considered a radical notion, was now a central theme in European politics. Yet this was not a smooth transition. As nationalist movements gained strength, so too did the opposition from those who had benefited from the old order: royal families, aristocrats, and conservative governments who saw these movements as a threat to their power. The revolutions of 1848, for example, can be seen as the first true test of the post-Waterloo European order. Across Europe, from Paris to Vienna, people took to the streets demanding greater political freedoms, national self-determination, and social reforms. These uprisings were a direct challenge to the balance of power that had been established at Vienna, and were in many ways the culmination of the forces Napoleon had unleashed decades earlier. The failure of these revolutions, in the short term, would only set the stage for further upheavals, including the unification of Germany and Italy, and eventually, the broader reshaping of Europe in the wake of World War I. Napoleon's influence was not limited to Europe's political systems. The very nature of warfare itself was altered by his campaigns. Military strategy had evolved during the Napoleonic Wars, and his methods became the foundation for modern warfare. The concept of total war, in which entire nations mobilized their resources and populations for the war effort, was born in the wake of Napoleon's empire. His military innovations, like the use of mass conscription, the rapid movement of troops, and the integration of artillery into field operations, were revolutionary and would go on to shape future conflicts, particularly the wars of the 20th century. In many ways, Napoleon had been both a product of the Enlightenment and a force that challenged its ideals. His reign had spread revolutionary principles across Europe, abolishing feudal systems, establishing legal equality, and promoting secular government. But in the end, his drive for power led to a paradox. While his military conquests spread the ideas of the French Revolution, his authoritarian rule contradicted those very ideals. Napoleon's political philosophy was one of centralization and control, a stark contrast to the republicanism and democracy championed by revolutionaries before him. It's this paradox that continues to make Napoleon such a fascinating figure in history. Was he a hero, an enlightened ruler who sought to improve the lives of the people he governed? Or was he a tyrant, bent on dominating Europe for his own glory? Historians continue to wrestle with these questions, And the answer is likely a mixture of both. Napoleon was a man of contradictions. His genius as a military strategist was undeniable, but his ambition and desire for power ultimately led to his downfall. Waterloo, then, is more than just a battle. It is the end of an era, but it is also the beginning of new struggles that would continue to shape Europe for the rest of the 19th century and beyond. The rise of nationalism, the challenge to monarchies, the evolution of military strategy, all of these forces were set in motion by the events of Waterloo and the fall of Napoleon. And while the immediate impact of the battle was the defeat of one man, the broader consequences will be felt for generations to come. The battle itself, its tactics, and its aftermath are studied by military historians as the ultimate lesson in the limits of power. Napoleon's inability to see the limitations of his own strategies, his failure to adapt to changing circumstances, and his underestimation of the resilience of his enemies all contributed to his downfall. But in his defeat, Napoleon also provided the world with a powerful reminder that even the greatest empires can crumble and that the future of Europe would never be the same again. Waterloo's impact on European diplomacy stretched far beyond the immediate consequences of Napoleon's defeat. It reshaped the continent's political structures, reinforcing the dominance of monarchies, but simultaneously sowing the seeds for modern nation-states. The victory of the Allies over Napoleon did not simply mark the end of an era of conquest. It signaled the beginning of a new geopolitical landscape, one that would be defined by shifting alliances, emerging national identities, and, inevitably, further conflict. The immediate peace, forged at the Congress of Vienna, sought to restore Europe to a semblance of order after the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars. The great powers of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, with Wellington serving as a key negotiator, drew up treaties aimed at preserving the balance of power. But this delicate balance was always on the brink of collapse, as the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which had been spread by Napoleon, had sparked an irreversible change in Europe's political atmosphere. The restoration of monarchies and the old order was superficial at best, with liberal and nationalist movements growing in strength under the surface. Historians love to point out the irony that while the Congress of Vienna aimed to restore the pre-Napoleonic status quo, it was the very spread of the ideals Napoleon had championed that would give rise to the political revolutions that followed. The Congress sought to create a stable Europe by containing the forces of revolution, but by failing to address the underlying tensions, like nationalism and democratic aspirations, they inadvertently laid the groundwork for future upheavals. The rise of nationalism was the most significant challenge to the post-Waterloo peace. Nationalism, which had grown during Napoleon's reign, now found expression in the form of movements across Europe that sought to create unified nation-states out of the fragmented political entities that had existed for centuries. Italy and Germany, in particular, would undergo processes of unification in the mid-19th century, driven by the same nationalist fervor that had been unleashed by Napoleon's campaigns. These movements were often met with resistance from conservative monarchies, but they were unstoppable. The old borders, the old loyalties, and the old political systems were increasingly out of step with the new forces of modernity that Napoleon had helped to unleash. One of the most remarkable things about the aftermath of Waterloo was that, despite the failure of Napoleon's empire, his ideas lived on. The Napoleonic Code, a set of legal reforms that Napoleon had introduced across the territories he controlled, remained a lasting legacy. Many European nations, including Italy, Spain, and Belgium, adopted elements of the code, and it continues to influence legal systems around the world. Napoleon had fundamentally reshaped the way people thought about law, rights, and citizenship, and those changes would endure long after his downfall. But there was another, darker legacy that emerged from the battle: the militarization of Europe. Waterloo was, after all, a battle that involved massive armies, innovative tactics, and immense casualties. It was a reminder of the power and destructiveness of modern warfare. The period after Waterloo saw a renewed focus on military preparedness, and the major powers of Europe began to increase their armies and navies. Military leaders across Europe studied Napoleon's campaigns, learning from both his successes and his failures. Napoleon's legacy as a military strategist was enshrined in the annals of history, and his influence on future wars, especially World War I, would be profound. Yet, for all its military focus, Waterloo was also a clash of ideologies. Napoleon's defeat was not just about military superiority. It was also about the failure of his vision for Europe. The ideological struggle between the French Revolution's values, liberty, equality, fraternity, and the conservative monarchies that sought to undo its work was a key factor in Waterloo's outcome. Napoleon's vision for a united Europe under French leadership was rooted in the principles of the Revolution, but the Allies who defeated him were determined to restore a monarchy-based order, one where national sovereignty and the power of kings were paramount. And yet, despite their efforts, Europe would never return to the way it was before Napoleon. The forces of change were too strong. Nationalism, liberalism, and the quest for self-determination had been unleashed, and there was no going back. The revolutions of 1848, the rise of Italian and German unification, and the eventual collapse of the old monarchies in the 20th century were all direct consequences of the ideas that had been propagated during the Napoleonic era. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo did not mark the end of his influence. It merely shifted the form of that influence. Though he was exiled and his empire crumbled, the ideas he championed continued to shape the future of Europe and beyond. His legacy was not just in his military victories or his political ambitions, but in the profound transformation of Europe's political landscape. A transformation that was set in motion at Waterloo, and that would continue to unfold for generations to come. Historians, looking back, can see how the world that emerged from the ashes of Napoleon's empire was both a product of his vision and a rejection of it. His defeat at Waterloo was a moment of finality, but it was also a moment of transition. Europe was not simply going back to the way it had been before the French Revolution. It was moving forward into a new era. Waterloo may have been the end of Napoleon, but it was also the beginning of the modern world as we know it. The end of the Napoleonic Wars was not just a military victory for the Allies. It marked the beginning of a new era of diplomacy, nationalism, and political experimentation that would take Europe in directions few could have predicted. While the Congress of Vienna sought to stabilize Europe by restoring the old order, it was clear that the forces Napoleon had unleashed, nationalism, liberalism, and the desire for self-determination, were far from quelled. In fact, these forces were now ready to take on a life of their own. As the European powers focused on rebuilding and securing peace, they had to deal with the ever-present tension between the old monarchies and the rising tide of new political ideologies. This tension would erupt in a series of uprisings and revolutions across the continent, from Italy to Germany, and would ultimately lead to the restructuring of Europe in ways that no one could have predicted at the time of Waterloo. One of the most significant legacies of Waterloo was the rise of nationalism. Napoleon's conquest of Europe had stirred national consciousness in regions that had once been fragmented into small kingdoms, duchies, and principalities. Italy and Germany were two of the most notable examples of regions that, under Napoleon's reign, began to see the possibility of unification. The ideals of the French Revolution, particularly the notion of popular sovereignty and the power of the people to determine their own destiny, had taken root, and after Napoleon's fall, they would become the driving forces behind the creation of unified nation-states. In Italy, the struggle for unification began in earnest in the 1830s and culminated in the creation of the Kingdom of Italy in 1861. Similarly, in Germany, the movement toward unification gained momentum with the establishment of the German Empire in 1871. These national movements, inspired by the ideals Napoleon had spread, were not simply a reaction to the Napoleonic Wars, but a continuation of the revolutionary forces that had been set in motion by his conquests. Historians still debate how much Napoleon's own ambitions contributed to the eventual unification of Italy and Germany. Was he a catalyst for these movements, or were they inevitable, regardless of his actions? The answer lies somewhere in between, as the political conditions Napoleon created helped to fuel the nationalistic sentiment that would define Europe in the 19th century. Napoleon's fall also led to a shift in the way wars were fought. While the Battle of Waterloo marked the end of one of the most remarkable military careers in history, the lessons learned from Napoleon's tactics would shape future conflicts. His emphasis on speed, mobility, and the integration of artillery into battle would influence military strategy for years to come. Future generals would study his campaigns closely, learning from both his successes and his mistakes. In fact, many of the techniques Napoleon pioneered would come to be used in the industrialized wars of the 20th century. Yet, for all of Napoleon's genius on the battlefield, his inability to adapt to the changing political landscape was his downfall. The shift in the balance of power, the increasing influence of nationalist movements, and the rise of modern diplomacy were all forces that he failed to reckon with. His empire was built on military dominance, but it lacked the political foundation necessary to sustain it in the long term. The Allies who defeated him at Waterloo were not just military powers. They were political forces that understood the shifting tides of European history and were willing to adapt to them. Napoleon, for all his brilliance, was a man of the past, locked in an older model of empire and conquest that had no place in the new world that was emerging. Waterloo, then, is not just the story of a single battle. It is the story of the end of one world and the beginning of another. The battle marks the conclusion of the Napoleonic era, but the ideas he left behind would continue to shape Europe for generations. The forces of nationalism, liberalism, and democracy, often in opposition to the old conservative order, would sweep across Europe, challenging monarchies and aristocracies. The political and social landscape of the continent was changing, and Waterloo was the catalyst for this transformation. In the years following Waterloo, Europe would experience a series of upheavals, from the revolutions of 1848 to the unification of Italy and Germany. These movements, though often met with repression, were fueled by the same ideals Napoleon had espoused. The idea that the people, not monarchs, should be the ultimate source of political power. These movements, born in the aftermath of Napoleon's fall, would lead to the creation of modern European states and would reshape the balance of power across the continent. For Napoleon, Waterloo was his final act, his ultimate defeat and the end of his empire. But for Europe, it was only the beginning of a new chapter. The political, military, and social changes that began with his rise and fall would continue to reverberate through the centuries. The legacy of Waterloo is not just the end of one man's reign. It is the beginning of the modern world as we know it, a world shaped by the forces of nationalism, democracy, and the desire for self-determination. As the dust from Waterloo settles, it's clear that the battle, while marking the end of Napoleon's reign, wasn't a decisive close to the larger conflicts of the time. Instead, it was merely the last chapter of one era and the prelude to another. The European powers, now victorious and emboldened by their triumph, began their task of securing a peace that could last for the foreseeable future. But securing that peace would prove a challenge far more complex than anyone could have anticipated, as the ideological shift sparked by Napoleon's reign could not be undone by a simple military victory. The Treaty of Paris, which followed the Congress of Vienna, was intended to establish a new European order, one based on the balance of power. But what often gets overlooked is the inherent instability of this arrangement. While the monarchs of Europe had successfully managed to remove the French threat from their midst, they had not resolved the deep-seated political fractures across the continent. The old monarchies, trying to maintain control, found themselves increasingly challenged by the forces of nationalism and liberalism, which had gained strength during Napoleon's reign. These movements were no longer easily quashed by royal decrees or military power. The people who had once rallied under Napoleon's banner now rallied under their own nation's banners. Historians still argue whether the Congress of Vienna truly brought lasting peace to Europe. Some point to the relative stability that followed the Congress, suggesting that it provided a buffer against large-scale war for nearly a century. Others, however, argue that the Congress simply papered over the cracks, leaving Europe vulnerable to future conflict. The seeds of revolution were already planted. The upheavals that would erupt in 1848 were a direct response to the conservative policies of the Congress. These were the first signs that Europe was moving away from a monarchic order and toward modern political systems, born out of the lessons learned from Napoleon's rise and fall. But beyond the political shifts, the cultural impact of Waterloo was profound. Napoleon had been a figure larger than life, and even in defeat, his image remained etched in the collective consciousness of Europe. His military genius, his grand vision for a unified Europe, and his fall from grace were the stuff of legend. He was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol of ambition, revolution, and tragedy. The French writer Victor Hugo, in his novel Les Miserables, famously captured the spirit of Napoleon's legacy, portraying the emperor's impact not just on the battlefield, but on the very heart of French society. In many ways, Napoleon became the quintessential tragic hero, his downfall a reminder of the dangers of hubris, but also of the transformative power of one individual's vision. But the myth of Napoleon wasn't confined to France. Across Europe, Napoleon's legacy had a far-reaching impact on military strategy, governance, and national identity. His ability to mobilize vast armies and reshape political structures had left an indelible mark. The Napoleonic Code, which had reformed legal systems across Europe, would continue to influence legal thought in countries around the world for centuries. Napoleon's reforms in education, infrastructure, and even his reorganization of the church would have lasting effects in the territories he controlled. His image was transformed from that of a conqueror into that of a reformer, a man whose grand ambitions ultimately paved the way for the modern world. However, this myth, while powerful, was also deeply contradictory. Napoleon had been a liberator, a destroyer, and an emperor all at once. To some, he was a hero who had challenged the entrenched aristocratic powers of Europe. To others, he was a tyrant, a man who used the ideals of the French Revolution to consolidate power in his own hands. As historians continue to debate his legacy, one thing is clear. Napoleon's influence was too great to be contained by a single narrative. His story is one of ambition, revolution, and empire, but it is also one of failure and the limits of power. And while Waterloo ended his political career, it did nothing to diminish the power of the myth that he had created. At the same time, the fall of Napoleon also created new opportunities for those who had once been his enemies. The leaders of Europe, particularly those from Britain, Prussia, and Austria, would now have the chance to shape Europe in their own image. But their task was not an easy one. The forces Napoleon had unleashed, the spread of revolutionary ideals, the rise of nationalism, and the demand for democratic governance, could not simply be erased by royal decrees. The balance of power that emerged after Waterloo was fragile, and it would not be long before the pressures of the 19th century began to erode it. The revolutions of 1848 were only the beginning of a new era, one where the power of monarchs would continue to wane and the power of the people would rise. In the years that followed, Europe would continue to change in profound ways. The defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo did not mark the end of the age of revolution. It was merely a prelude. The idea of the nation-state would spread across Europe like wildfire, fueled by the same ideals that Napoleon had carried into battle. In France, the overthrow of Napoleon's empire gave rise to the July Monarchy, while across Europe, nationalistic movements grew stronger. And even as monarchies tried to regain control, the world was moving in a different direction, toward democratic governance, political reform, and the eventual reshaping of the European continent. Waterloo, in the end, was not just the final chapter in the life of one man, but the beginning of the modern world. The political and ideological forces set in motion by Napoleon's reign would continue to shape Europe for the rest of the century and beyond. As the old European order crumbled, new political ideas emerged. Ideas that would ultimately lead to the world wars, the collapse of empires, and the rise of new global powers. In this sense, Waterloo was not just the end of Napoleon. It was the beginning of the 20th century, a century of new conflicts, new ideologies, and new forms of governance that would forever alter the world. The legacy of Waterloo continued to shape Europe long after the battle ended. As the 19th century unfolded, the world witnessed a series of monumental changes. each one rooted in the ideological and political upheavals Napoleon's reign had set in motion. The battle itself, while crucial, became less a single event and more a symbol of the larger forces at play. Forces that would transform European societies, governments, and armies forever. The shifting balance of power in Europe, which was one of the primary objectives of the Congress of Vienna, was never entirely secure. While the Congress succeeded in creating a temporary peace by restoring many of the old monarchies and reasserting conservative values, it failed to eliminate the underlying currents of change that had been ignited by the French Revolution and Napoleon's empire. These currents, nationalism, liberalism, and the desire for self-determination, couldn't be suppressed by royal decrees or military might alone. In the years following Waterloo, these forces would only grow stronger, culminating in revolutions and political upheavals that reshaped the European continent. The revolutions of 1848, often referred to as the springtime of nations, were the most direct manifestation of these growing tensions. In France, Austria, Prussia, and other parts of Europe, revolutionaries took to the streets, demanding greater political rights, national unification, and the end of oppressive monarchies. The seeds of these revolutions had been sown during the Napoleonic Wars, and the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo only delayed their inevitable eruption. The success of these revolutions was mixed, but they marked the beginning of a broader shift away from monarchy toward republicanism, socialism, and eventually modern democracy. Perhaps one of the most significant outcomes of Napoleon's downfall was the way it reshaped the military landscape of Europe. Before Napoleon, wars were often fought by small, professional armies that relied on the old aristocratic traditions of warfare. Napoleon, however, revolutionized warfare by creating large, conscripted armies that were designed to fight on a massive scale. His innovations in military strategy, tactics, and logistics would influence the design of armies for decades to come. As military leaders across Europe studied his campaigns, many sought to adapt and refine his methods, recognizing the need for large, well-coordinated forces capable of rapid maneuver and flexible tactics. This new style of warfare would prove to be both a boon and a curse for Europe in the coming century. While it allowed for greater military efficiency and the ability to wage larger and more destructive wars, it also meant that future conflicts, especially the two world wars of the 20th century, will be fought on a scale never before seen in human history. Waterloo, in many ways, marked the beginning of this new era of total war, where entire nations would be mobilized for conflict. The lessons of Napoleon's campaigns would be passed down, and his shadow would loom over military strategy long after his death. But while Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon's direct influence, it was not the end of his impact on European politics. His downfall had demonstrated to the world that a single man's ambitions could shape the fate of nations. The ideals he championed, such as equality before the law, merit-based advancement, and the sovereignty of the people, had spread far beyond the borders of France. These ideals had fueled the rise of nationalism and democratic movements in countries across Europe, and they would continue to inspire political change throughout the century. Even in exile on St. Helena, Napoleon remained a figure of immense influence. His writings, particularly his memoirs, provided a window into his thoughts on war, politics, and governance. For many, these writings became a source of inspiration, as Napoleon's ideas on governance and power management offered an alternative to the conservative monarchies that dominated Europe. His thoughts on the importance of merit over aristocratic privilege and his belief in the rule of law resonated with those seeking political reform. His exile may have removed him from the stage of active politics, but it did not end his political influence. Napoleon's role as both a symbol of revolution and a dictator also made him a paradoxical figure in European history. He was admired by some for his genius, vision, and ability to unite Europe under a single banner. Yet, for others, he remained a cautionary tale, a man whose insatiable thirst for power led him to the brink of ruin. In the decades following his defeat, both sides of this debate continued to be voiced, and Napoleon's figure became a symbol for various political movements throughout Europe. Some saw him as a hero, others as a tyrant, but no one could deny the magnitude of his impact. The larger narrative that unfolded after Waterloo was one of transformation, politically, socially, and culturally. The war that had torn Europe apart had also created the conditions for its rebuilding. The old world order, with its kings and emperors, was slowly giving way to a new one defined by the rise of the nation-state, mass politics, and modern warfare. The Treaty of Versailles after World War I, the foundation of the European Union, and the social upheavals of the 20th century can all trace their roots back to the changes Napoleon brought about. In retrospect, the Battle of Waterloo was not merely a military conflict. It was the conclusion of an era, a pivotal point in history where the forces of revolution collided with the entrenched power of monarchies. It showed the world the tremendous power of one individual to change the course of history, but also the consequences of unchecked ambition. Waterloo was a defeat, yes, but it was also a turning point in the evolution of Europe, a moment when the course of the future was shaped not by one man's dreams of empire, but by the will of the people. As we near the end of this journey through the shadow of Waterloo, it becomes clear that the battle's influence didn't merely rest in its immediate aftermath. It laid the groundwork for the political and military developments of the 19th and 20th centuries. Europe, having weathered the storms of Napoleonic conquest, was not returning to its former state. Instead, it was stepping into a new, unpredictable age defined by industrialization, the rise of new ideologies, and the emergence of mass politics. Waterloo was the closing act of one world, but also the opening scene of another, an era where the traditional order would be tested, torn down, and rebuilt. The defeat of Napoleon was certainly a triumph for the monarchies of Europe, who had long sought to curb the revolutionary forces unleashed by the French Revolution. The restoration of monarchies and conservative ideals at the Congress of Vienna was intended to preserve the old order and prevent further upheaval. Yet what the Congress could not do, what Napoleon's defeat could not undo, was the spread of revolutionary ideals. Nationalism, liberalism, and the demand for democratic representation had gained too much ground during Napoleon's reign. These ideas would continue to fuel political movements across Europe, leading to revolutions and reforms long after the final shots were fired at Waterloo. One of the most enduring legacies of Napoleon's downfall was the rise of nationalism. The idea that a nation, defined by common culture, language, and history, should be a unified state was something Napoleon's conquests had sparked across Europe. The very territories Napoleon had sought to dominate had begun to develop their own sense of national identity, with citizens now seeing themselves not as subjects of a monarch, but as part of a greater, unified people. This new form of identity, nationalism, would have profound consequences in the decades to come. Germany and Italy, two of the most significant political entities in 19th century Europe, were transformed by the forces Napoleon set in motion. The German Confederation, which had been created after the Congress of Vienna, eventually gave way to a unified Germany in 1871, partly due to the influence of nationalist movements. Similarly, Italy, which had been fragmented into various states, was unified under the leadership of figures like Garibaldi and Cavour, inspired in part by the ideals of the French Revolution and the legacy of Napoleon's empire. Napoleon had created the conditions for unification in both regions, even though it was the forces of nationalism, rather than his empire, that ultimately brought those nations together. Historians still debate how much Napoleon himself would have embraced the outcomes of these national movements. He had, after all, envisioned a united Europe under French control, but the idea of an empire was at odds with the concept of national self-determination. Napoleon had sought to impose unity through military conquest, but the movements that followed sought unity through cultural and political cooperation. In the long run, the idea of the nation-state, which Napoleon had inadvertently helped create, would replace the idea of empire as the dominant political structure in Europe. Waterloo, while a military defeat, set in motion changes that Napoleon likely could not have foreseen. His final defeat proved that even the most powerful empires could collapse, but it also revealed the resilience of the ideas he had spread across Europe. His military genius, while a defining characteristic of his rule, could not sustain the empire he had built. The political landscape of Europe had changed, and it was now up to new leaders to navigate the complexities of this evolving world. Yet, despite the shifting political landscape, there was still the specter of Napoleon's shadow over Europe. The political and military leaders who emerged after Waterloo were often influenced by Napoleon's strategies and vision. His innovations in warfare, especially his ability to organize and mobilize large armies, became the foundation of modern military thinking. His use of artillery, combined arms tactics, and mass conscription would shape military doctrine for decades. Even as the world moved into the 20th century, the echoes of Napoleon's influence were felt in the way wars were fought. In the world of politics, Napoleon's fall also opened the door for new forms of governance. His time in power had shown the potential of centralized leadership and the power of charismatic, reformist leaders. While Napoleon's own reign ended in defeat, the example he set of a leader who could rise from humble beginnings to reshape a continent remained a potent inspiration. Leaders like Otto von Bismarck in Germany, and even leaders in the newly emerging nations of Latin America, would draw on Napoleon's example as they sought to unite their countries and implement sweeping reforms. At the same time, Napoleon's fall was a lesson in the dangers of overreach. His belief that he could conquer all of Europe, that he could remake the world in his image, ultimately led to his undoing. The lesson of Waterloo was clear. Even the most brilliant strategists, even those with an unshakable vision, must understand the limits of power. Napoleon's ambition had been his greatest strength, but it was also his greatest weakness. His fall showed that unchecked ambition, when coupled with the failure to recognize the shifting tides of history, could lead to collapse. The end of Waterloo, though, did not mean the end of Napoleon's influence. Instead, his defeat was a hinge in history that led to the transformation of Europe. It was the end of one chapter, the Napoleonic Empire, and the beginning of another, an era defined by the rise of nationalism, modern warfare, and the reshaping of European power structures. Though the battle was lost, Napoleon's impact would continue to shape the course of history, his ideas leaving an indelible mark on the world for generations to come. The final echoes of Waterloo reverberate into the 20th century, reshaping not just Europe but the entire world order. Napoleon's defeat marked the end of the Napoleonic era, but his legacy of reshaping national boundaries, pushing for legal reform, and inspiring revolutionary movements didn't fade with his exile. Instead, it morphed into something far more enduring, a reminder of the power one individual can wield and the limits of that power when ambition becomes unchecked. In the decades that followed, Europe would face new trials, ones Napoleon himself might have struggled to envision. The political order established at the Congress of Vienna, designed to restore balance and prevent further revolutionary upheaval, was built on shaky foundations. It assumed that the old monarchies could suppress the revolutionary ideals Napoleon had spread, but by the mid-19th century, these monarchies found themselves facing increasingly powerful waves of nationalist sentiment and calls for democratic reforms. Historians still debate whether the balance of power created by the Congress of Vienna was ultimately successful in preventing another war. On the surface, the decades following Waterloo, known as the Concert of Europe, appear to be a period of relative peace. Major wars were absent from the continent, and the monarchs of Europe worked together to maintain stability. However, this peace was not born from shared interests or goodwill. Rather, it was sustained by mutual fear of the revolutionary forces that could ignite another war. This fragile peace was built on a combination of suppression, diplomacy, and the increasing challenge of addressing the aspirations of the people. The most immediate manifestation of the ideological struggle that Waterloo set in motion came in the form of the revolutions of 1848, which spread across Europe like wildfire. From Paris to Vienna, from Berlin to Milan, crowds of people, fueled by the ideals of freedom, equality, and nationalism, took to the streets to challenge the conservative monarchies that had been restored after Napoleon's fall. These revolutions were failures in the short term, as conservative powers crushed the uprisings with military force. But in their wake, the winds of change had been stirred, and the ideas Napoleon had spread of liberty, democracy, and national sovereignty could not be undone. In hindsight, we can see that Waterloo, while a decisive military victory, was the beginning of a shift away from empire and monarchy to the modern nation-state. This transformation didn't happen overnight, but in the decades that followed, the struggle for national unification and self-determination would shape the political landscape of Europe. The unification of Germany and Italy, for instance, was the product of nationalist movements that had been sparked by the very ideas Napoleon had championed. His reforms, including the Napoleonic Code, had laid the groundwork for the modern legal and political systems that would underpin these movements. Furthermore, Napoleon's reorganization of Europe had created new political entities that could no longer be ignored. His creation of the Confederation of the Rhine and his redrawing of borders made it impossible to return to the old political structures that had existed before his rise. Even though Napoleon's empire was gone, the territories he had controlled were permanently altered, making the idea of a unified Europe, or at least a Europe of nation-states, more than just a distant ideal. Waterloo may have been the end of Napoleon's reign, but it also served as a crucial turning point in the development of modern Europe. The collapse of his empire left a vacuum, one that would be filled by new forces of change, nationalism, democracy, and the desire for political self-determination. While the Congress of Vienna sought to suppress these forces, they could not be contained forever. In the long run, Napoleon's defeat did not mark the end of revolutionary ideals, but rather the beginning of a broader transformation that would eventually lead to the fall of monarchies and the rise of modern states. As for Napoleon himself, his exile to St. Helena marked the final chapter in his remarkable life. He would spend his remaining years reflecting on his empire, his downfall, and the nature of power. His memoirs, written during this time, would become a powerful source for future generations, not just as a personal account, but as a reflection of his broader vision for Europe. Despite his fall, Napoleon's ideas continued to shape European politics and military strategy. He had been defeated, but his imprint on history was indelible. And so, Waterloo stands as both a victory and a defeat. It was the end of an era defined by one man's ambition, but it also marked the beginning of an era defined by the forces of nationalism, revolution, and the shift from empires to nation-states. It was the end of a Napoleonic dream of a unified Europe under French rule, but it was the birth of a new Europe, one that would grapple with the questions of identity, sovereignty, and democracy for generations to come. The political landscape of Europe would continue to shift from the unifications of Germany and Italy to the conflicts of the 20th century, culminating in world wars that would reshape the continent once again. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo might have brought a temporary peace, but the ideas he left behind, of a Europe defined by nationalism, legal reform, and political change, were the true legacy of his reign. As the centuries passed, Europe would continue to reckon with the contradictions of his legacy. Was he a liberator or a tyrant? A visionary or a man undone by his own ambition? The answer, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. But one thing is certain: Waterloo may have been his final battle, but the reverberations of his empire and his downfall continue to echo through history.